Hello, this is Matthew, and welcome to a quick video today about a new little utility that I created, really just a single shell script over the weekend that allows you to, as the tagline here says, instantly provision local Linux VMs. This uses QEMU and KVM, of course. KVM is the hypervisor in the Linux kernel, and then QEMU, in addition to being a wonderful project in its own right as a system simulator for a number of different architectures, is also the front end for KVM. This really grew out of a just hacked together messy script that I keep in my home directory that I've had for the last couple of years, because multiple times a day, usually, I need to just spin up a quick VM to test either how something works in a different Linux distribution than I normally use, right? If I'm using Arch Linux on my desktop and I want to see how something works in one of the Red Hat-like distros or Ubuntu or Debian, or also if I just want to try out a package or some software or a script that I don't necessarily want to have any ability to mess up my real desktop system, I'll just spin up a quick local VM, SSH into it, try out what I want to try out, and then usually shut the VM down and delete it. And that's just a great quick workflow for me. And like I said, I've had the script for a number of years that somewhat automates this process, mainly just so that I don't forget the commands I use to do all of this. And I got to thinking, it'd be nice to flesh the script out a little bit more, have it actually prompt me for some information instead of having to edit it and copy the commands and move them around every time. And then that led to, I could probably even go a little step further and make it a script that is kind of nice and polished for a bunch of people to use. So here we are. And I say this is going to be a quick video. Usually when I say that, I'm lying. This time, we're going to do what we can to keep it under the half-hour mark. This is pretty quick, pretty straightforward, not a lot of explanation needed. So I think what I'm going to do is let's just dive into a demo. And then if you're interested, I'll circle back after the demo just to talk through sort of more of the details that are covered in this README. But if you don't like watching videos, feel free to just go to this repository, clone it, get the script, read the README, start playing with it on your own. But let's do the demo so you can see what it is that this little VM provisioning script does. There are some requirements, of course. There are some utilities that have to be installed. Probably the cloud local DS utility is not installed on your system. The other ones probably already are. But don't worry, if you run the script and one of these utilities cannot be found, the script will recommend the appropriate package names to install for a variety of different types of distributions. So just try running the script and it will guide you if you need to install something else. But if we go down to the quick start, you clone the repository, of course, go into the directory, and then you just run the create script, and I'll show you what happens when you do that. So let's copy this git clone command, go over to the terminal here, paste that in, and we'll go into that VM provision directory. You can see here that we have, these are actually a couple of empty directories, images. This is where we're going to cache and hold the base images for the operating systems. And then VMs are our virtual machines. This is where the virtual machines will be created. But we're just interested in this create.sh script. So run create.sh to tell it, I'm ready to create a new virtual machine. The script uses this dialog interface, so that's why the dialog command is a prerequisite. But the first thing it'll ask is, what Linux distribution do you want? You can see here that I've built the script to support the last couple of releases of the sort of mainline long-term supported Linux distributions. So Alma Linux 8 and 9, Debian 11 and 12, Rocky 8 and 9, and then Ubuntu LTS 2004 and 2204. And then a couple of the current releases of a selection of other distros. So the latest Arch Linux image they publish. Fedora 38 is the latest Fedora, OpenSUSE Leap 15.5. and the latest version of Ubuntu if you just wanted to try something with the latest and greatest versions of packages in Ubuntu, not the ones in the LTS releases. So you just use the arrow keys, choose the distribution. I'll start with Debian 12 because I'm, of course, usually a Debian guy. You hit enter. Now, the first time you choose the distribution from that menu, it will have to go out and download the base cloud image for that distribution. So these are usually, the Debian one here is 266 megabytes. I think the Red Hat based ones are on the larger side. So the Alma Linux one is maybe 500 some megabytes. So they download pretty quickly over a regular fast internet connection these days. And you're presented with the form for your VM options. So all of these fields are required. A couple of them have defaulted. Username, for example, is going to default to whatever user you're currently logged into your host system as. That's Stream in my case. I have a user that I record videos and do streaming from. We'll also look for a suitable SSH public key in the usual places, but we'll get down to there. Host name, let's just call this test VM. Domain name, this is plugging into my local home network where my domain name is home.mattwilson.org. The IP address I want for this VM, and as we'll talk about, this is using bridged networking, so it will just connect to whatever physical network your bridged interface is set up to connect to. So this is my normal home network. So I think .183 is the available IP address, and then you put in the net mask using the CIDR notation here. Because, long story short, we feed this data in through CloudInit, and CloudInit network always requires the net mask as well in this notation. It's not just going to default to a Class C if you're using Class C address space. So anyway, you just type in your IP address. Gateway IP, again, this is going to be whatever network this is actually plugging into. So that'll be 42.1 in my case. Space separated list of one or more DNS servers. So you can just use Cloudflare, you can use Google. I run DNS infrastructure internally in my house. So I have 2 DNS servers here. So I'll put both of those in. BR0 is my network bridge interface. This is set up for bridged networking. So you have to have a bridged network interface available for QEMU to use. I'm going to switch over to the web browser really briefly here just to make a note, and we can talk more about this later, but I do have a section in the README with a little bit of explanation and a couple examples of systemd network systems, how you might set up a bridge interface, and Debian systems with their etc network interfaces file, how you might set up your bridge interface. I just always use bridged networking for my VMs, for my SimH simulated systems, right? My VAX systems are connected to my network using tap network devices that are in a network bridge that is also on my physical interface. So I never do any of the host mode network stuff or QEMU's built-in networking or NAT stuff. I just plug my VMs right into my real network. So that's how the script does it. If you don't like it, and you know how you do QEMU networking, it'll be easy enough for you to change the start script that gets created or even modify the create script so that all of your VMs get created with a start script. But I use bridged networking, so that's what my script sets you up for. Okay, so that's my bridge network interface, BR0. Username, you can change this to whatever user you want to have created in your new VM. I'll call this, I don't know, I'll just call it mwilson. SSH key, we will look in your home directory, in your SSH directory for either an ID ed25519.pub or an ID rsa.pub public key, but you don't have to use that if you have a different key pair that you want to use. Just wherever the public key is, put that path here, and this public key is going to be added to this user's authorized keys file in the new VM. So that's the only way you'll be able to log into this VM is over the network with SSH using your SSH key that corresponds to the public key that gets put in the user's authorized keys file. RAM in megabytes, 4 gigs of RAM is fine. Disk size in gigabytes, 16 gigs of disk, of course, just for this demo is fine. Number of CPUs, I have plenty of cores to spare, so I may as well give my VM 4 CPUs. Okay, so you just hit enter and it will create your VM for you. Again, we had already downloaded that image earlier, so it doesn't have to do that. Resizes it to 16 gigs. That's just a metadata field in the QCOW2 format. So on disk, it's still no bigger than whatever that downloaded image was. It just now indicates that as far as the operating system in the guest is concerned, the disk can grow to 16 gigs. And it gives you some instructions here. It says your VM's ready to go. You've changed to the directory it created, and you're able to start it. After you start it, it just takes really a few seconds to boot usually, usually no longer than 30 seconds on a decently fast host system. You're able to SSH into the machine at its IP address that you assigned with the username that you asked it to create. So let's do that. Let's go into VMs/test-VM. You can see here it created a couple of files. It created the hard drive image, created the metadata source. This is how CloudInit configures these things. We'll talk about that in a minute if you're curious, but you don't need to know how it works for it to work. It will just work for you when you're using the script. So I will run start testvm.sh, and this is going to boot up my new virtual machine. So like I said, give it a few seconds, get ready to SSH into it. I told it I wanted the user named mwilson. 192.168.42.183 is its IP address, and it may already be booted and configured and ready to go. Yep, sure enough. So first time I've seen this host key fingerprint, so of course I'll accept that. And then I just need to enter the passphrase for my SSH private key in this case. And we're in. We have a, if everything worked, OS release, yep, a Debian 12 virtual machine running here. You can see it has a 16 gigabyte disk because that's what we asked for. It has about 4 gigabytes of RAM because that's what we asked for. So now we're ready to do, update our apt sources. Oh, have to do that as root, of course. So the user that gets created is able to use sudo, and we're up and running. I can now do whatever it is that I wanted this VM for. And of course I can disconnect, I can reconnect. In fact, hold on, let me add my, I'll just add my SSH key to my SSH agent here so I don't have to keep typing in that long passphrase every time I demonstrate connecting to the system. So I'm able to SSH back into it, of course, and I can leave that running, or if I just wanted to test something quickly, once I'm done with that, I can shut down my VM. And as soon as it disconnects me and shuts down here, the actual virtual machine has already shut down. Yeah, there's no more QEMU process running. So that's it. So just to demonstrate that again, I run the create script. I choose my distribution. Again, I've already made a Debian 12 VM, so there was no download step there. And you'll note the next time I run it, it has remembered all of my options from last time. So it didn't default to my logged in username. It kept the one from last time. If I changed the key, it would have changed that. So if I want to make another one, I'm usually just changing the host name, changing the IP address, and 99% of the time, the rest of the options are the same every time I create a new VM. So that's why I just have it remember them, and you just quickly enter the new host name, the modified IP address, and now I have a second VM that I can go into and start that VM. And of course, after, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, I'll be able to SSH into it. So it's not quite started up yet. Let's give it a few more seconds. Oh, it's actually thinking about it a little bit this time. There we go. My VM's up and running, and I'm able to SSH into it with that user I told it to create. So test VM2, another Debian 12 VM. So we can leave that running, and then just sort of by way of demonstration, let's do one with a different distribution. So Alma Linux 9. The first time I choose that, again, it has to download it. And you may be asking, so where are these images coming from? What are they? If I switch back to the web browser, most of the Linux distributions create these cloud images, and they are they can come in a variety of disk formats, but usually they'll have a QCOW2 disk format, which is perfect for use with QEMU. And they are usually minimal server-oriented installations of that distribution. And if you search for Alma Cloud Image, you'll be directed to the Alma Linux project. If you search for Debian Cloud Image, Debian makes them. If you search for Ubuntu Cloud Image, Ubuntu makes them, right? So again, most of the Linux distros make these images, and they're not just some random person on the internet installing it to a hard drive image and then uploading the hard drive image somewhere. These are official build products that are part of the release bundles whenever these Linux distributions make new releases. So it's just as official as downloading a CD image and installing it yourself into your VM's hard drive. So these are all being pulled from official sources. And the thing that is common among them that makes this work is they use the cloud init system. So they have a piece of software, a package installed inside of them already called cloud init. And cloud init is able to get metadata from cloud init metadata sources when the machine boots up. And that's how we're able to pass in the user creation we want, the network configuration we want, the host name, those kinds of things. So this is the exact same process that happens when you spin up a new VM at Google or at AWS or at DigitalOcean. They're using, either off-the-shelf official images, or they usually build their own in-house base images for the different Linux distributions they support. But wherever the image came from, they're all running cloud init to get data from the cloud provider's infrastructure. And that's how, when I make a new AWS VM and choose the SSH key I want, it's able to inject that SSH key in when that VM boots up. And it's how they're able to set the IP address in the VMs so that the allocated IP address is provided to the VM through Cloud Init. So it's configured correctly for you the first time you power it on. So in any case, that's part of what the script is doing, is it is building out the metadata files, and it's using the cloud local DS to build a local Cloud Init metadata source that gets attached to the virtual machine to provide that configuration information when you start up the VMs. So that's where those images are coming from. They are official, real images from the distribution providers that are just perfect for spinning up these QEMU local VMs. Okay, so of course the Alma downloaded long before I finished that little spiel on where they're coming from. But again, I can change that to testvm3. Let's make this one at .185. And as always, the rest of the options I probably just reuse every time. We could say, hey, this guy deserves 8 gigs of RAM and a 32 gig hard disk, but he only needs 2 CPUs. Perfect. Hit enter. It creates our VM for us, and we can go into that VM's directory and we can start the VM. And again, after not too long, that machine is going to boot. We can actually check. If we look now, pgrep-a QEMU, you can see we have 2 QEMU processes because I didn't shut down testvm2, and we're now starting up testvm3. So the first parameter I pass to QEMU in these startup scripts that gets generated is the name of the VM. So if you accidentally leave one running and you wonder, oh, which one do I need to connect into and shut down? testvm2, testvm3 are running. And that's just an easy way to know. It's like, oh, you know what? If I'm just done and I can't connect, or I just want to kill it, you'll know which QEMU process to kill, because you can see that, yes, this is the testvm3 process. So if I just wanted to kill testvm3, kill process ID 28733. Nevertheless, we've given this Alma Linux VM plenty of time to boot up. So let's SSH into it. Oops, it helps if I put the SSH command in front of it. And there we are. So in addition to our Debian 12 VM, we now have our Alma Linux 9.2 VM. Hey, look at that, the turquoise cod. Who would have thunk it? All right, so let's go ahead, and I may as well just shut these down. And remember, testvm2 was still running, which was 184 is the IP address I gave it. So yeah, we can shut down that guy as well. Okay. I guess the only other thing I'll point out, if we do Alma Linux again, this form does basic validation, so it's by no means bulletproof, but I'll at least make sure that you filled out all the fields. We'll call this Alma VM. If you forget the 24 or whatever your netmask is, it'll remind you the IP address must be of the form address/mask bits. So I can go back here and add my /24 back in. Yeah, if you forget, do I put a space or a comma between DNS names? It'll validate that and remind you that it's a space delimited list. It will make sure that this file actually exists. Can't read the public key file in because it doesn't exist. So again, if you put in bad network info that looks valid but isn't valid, this isn't going to catch that, right? It's just doing a couple of basic regular expression checks on the values. But it can help if, again, right, you forget the exact syntax for the IP address or something. So we'll go ahead and create that VM. And I'll start this in the background because I want to show you something in a minute. There we go. So that's the script. Quick, easy, makes local VMs for you. Exactly what it says on the tin. Oops, I lost my window here. There we go. So I talked to you about where those images come from, so we don't need those tabs anymore. Other notes in the README, bridged networking. Again, this is just how I run all my VMs, so that's how I wrote the script to work. Some hints on how to set that up in a couple of scenarios, but you may need to search the internet or ask ChatGPT. Or if you use QEMU networking in a different fashion, you can always modify the start script that gets created. You might have noticed I'm not using sudo to run those start VM scripts. I'm running them as my regular unprivileged user. I have a couple of notes here about how to make that work. Essentially, a regular user just needs permission to use KVM, which is done by giving them read and write permission to the dev KVM device. On the Linux distributions I use, they tend to come with a KVM group, so I just need to add my regular user to the KVM group, and that covers it. But you might need to look and see what the permissions are on the dev KVM device and add yourself to an appropriate group, or make yourself owner of dev KVM if you're the only user and you want to do it that way. Just whatever you want to do. Your user just needs to be able to use KVM. For the network config, hooking up to the network bridge, QEMU has a utility called the QEMU bridge helper, and that can be set to set UID root so that it's able to do what it needs to do even when you're just a regular user invoking it. It's actually QEMU that invokes it, but of course under your regular user. And then you have to create a little config file for it that tells it which bridges are the regular users allowed to connect to. So that's how I do it on my system to run QEMU as my regular user instead of running it as root. Of course, you can just run the VM start script as root, but I don't typically like running QEMU or things like SimH or Hercules as root. So I try and set up limited privileges such that they're able to do what they need to do with particularly network devices, or in the case of QEMU+KVM, as a regular user. But whatever's appropriate for your scenario, your system, you're in charge of your computer. So feel free to do it this way, or feel free to run it as root, or feel free to do something completely different that might work for you. If you need access to the serial console of the Linux operating system in the guest machine or the QEMU monitor, the QEMU monitor is the little text interface where you can type commands into QEMU to do things like change the CD that's in the virtual CD device, or add or remove hardware, those kinds of things that you can change at runtime. I create the serial console and the QEMU monitor as socket devices when the VM starts up. So you can connect to those a number of ways. I like to use SOCAT, and I set the escape sequence to be control caret, because that doesn't tend to be anything that I ever need to type into an actual Linux console session. So if we look back at that VM that I just created and started, let me copy this socket command here. You can see, because I started the VM, that it created the almavm-mon socket. You can see the S here. This is a socket device. And the almavm-serial socket. And I can run that command, and I can connect to Alma VM Mon, for example. And this is the QEMU monitor for this particular QEMU instance running that VM. So if you do things like info block, you can see the block devices that are connected. So the actual hard disk image, which is a QCOW2 image in this file, and that metadata source. So this is just how that cloud init system gets that configuration, which is, I think it's actually a CD ISO image, but just a raw image file on VirtIO1. I think info network. Yep. So here you can see my network device is a tap device attached to my bridge BR0. Here's the MAC address that we set up for it. Right. Okay. So that's the QEMU monitor. If you type quit, that is the quit command to QEMU, and your VM will be unceremoniously killed. So you don't want to quit EMU monitor unless you actually want to kill your VM. If you just want to get out of the monitor and get out of this socket session, you just use that escape sequence. So that's Control caret, so Control Shift 6. Now I'm back at the prompt. Similarly, you can connect to the machine's serial console. That's just like plugging in a serial cable to the back of the computer. And you can see here that we get the login prompt. Of course, I cannot log in here because there are no users that have any passwords set. If I needed to or had a need to log into these VMs on the console, you would have to first log in via SSH, set a password on the user, and then you'd be able to come in and log in via the console. Of course, if you're wanting to log into the console because the network configuration didn't work for some reason, you're just stuck. You just have to delete the VM and start over and try again. But again, the script, assuming your bridge is set up correctly, assuming you're giving it valid IP addresses on your network, right? When you start up your VM, you'll be able to SSH into it as that user that you created. So again, Control Shift 6 to get out of that. Back to the README. The last big part here is non-interactive or scripted use. So if you actually want to script the creation of running this script, maybe as part of a meta VM provisioning system, you can avoid all of that dialog interface by providing environment variables that answer all of the questions ahead of time. And if all of these values are provided and if they are valid, then the forms won't be displayed when you run create.sh. It will immediately just skip to creating that output directory, creating the script, and it'll be ready to run. You're also able to provide a subset of the options if you just want to override the defaults. So remember, if I run the create script, it defaults to all of the values that I used the previous time I successfully completed the script, right? So I'm getting the host name of Alma VM because I already have, that's what I did last time, right? If I hit enter here, it says the VM Alma VM already exists. It's not going to blow away that existing directory. But if I want to override the default, I'm able to provide the environment variable VM provision host name and say new VM. Now when I run the create script, whatever set of those environment variables I've set will override the default for this invocation of the script run. So it's now already put new VM in the host name. And again, if I provide all of the environment variables, it's not even going to pop up the form at all. So I'll just cancel out of that, but I think you get the idea there. And then that's also a convenient way where if you want to use base image from a Linux distribution that I haven't added to that menu, you're able to set the VM provision base image and download URL, and it will, if the file doesn't already exist in the images directory, download that image. Now you can use a private image that isn't downloadable by just putting it in the images directory first and setting your base image name to that image. And again, as long as Cloud init works properly and it's a QCOW2 QEMU image format, set that variable and then run the script, and you can fill out the rest of the details, and you'll get a new VM that when you boot up should let you SSH in, and you'll be using your own base image. And that's it. So yeah, if it sounds interesting, give it a try. If you think there are maybe some other Linux distributions that belong in that menu, and if they provide those working cloud images in a predictable download location. And if the cloud init system in them works correctly with the version of the cloud init metadata that we're using here. There's a reason I throw out those caveats, because there are a couple other images out there that haven't quite worked with this system yet. But yeah, if there are popular versions or distros out there that you want to see in the menu, it's pretty easy to add them. So just go ahead and open an issue here, and I'm happy to look at those and see if it makes sense to include that for a bunch of users. I've really only tested this on my host system here. So I have the latest QEMU version, and obviously things like my bridge setup are working the way that I have them set up. But if you run into any trouble, feel free to let me know, because again, I want this to be a useful utility that's pretty quick and easy to run for users who just might want to run these quick local Linux VMs. Again, I know it's a bit of a hassle to have to try and figure out this bridge network stuff to start with. The script isn't just 100% turnkey of download it, run it, and have these things working on your network like I just demonstrated. But if you do any local VMs with QEMU, I really do think it's worthwhile for you to just go ahead and get your system set up such that you can use bridged networking. So that way, VMs with both this script, but also just any other VMs you create, they can just be on your local network. And it's a lot easier than, having to forward ports through and pick specific ports that you want mapped through. And I don't know, maybe you're doing isolated testing of, malicious malware that opens network ports or tries to do stuff on your local network, right? In that case, you probably don't want it directly plugged in. You want a nice sandboxed off environment, but that's not my use case. I'm usually doing more development testing type stuff. So yeah, bridge network is great. Anyway, enough of me trying to convince you that you should just always use bridge networking. I will leave it at that. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.